Alex Carter's garage buzzed with the familiar hum of activity as wrenches clanked and engines roared under fluorescent lights. It was Christmas Eve, and though the world outside was wrapped in snow and holiday cheer, Alex's world remained grounded in the smell of motor oil and the steady rhythm of hard work. A single father of no one, as he often joked, Alex had poured himself into his craft, filling the void left by years of personal loss with the satisfaction of fixing things others deemed irreparable. That evening, as twilight dipped into night, Alex had made plans to join his co-workers for a modest holiday dinner. The garage staff, his makeshift family, had spent weeks preparing for this rare moment of celebration. They had managed to scrounge together enough to decorate the break room with tinsel and a slightly lopsided Christmas tree. For Alex, it was a chance to step away from the grease and grime and perhaps, just for one night, pretend that life was as festive as the world outside seemed to be. The last customer of the day had picked up their car hours ago, and the team was beginning to close shop. Alex wiped his hands on a worn rag, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he thought about the roast turkey and mashed potatoes waiting for him. Then, as if the universe had other plans, the unmistakable crunch of tires over icy gravel broke the stillness. Alex frowned and glanced at the clock. It was already past closing time. Outside, the headlights of an old sedan pierced the gathering dark, the car sputtering and groaning as it rolled into the driveway. A woman emerged, her figure wrapped in a heavy coat and scarf, her face pale and lined with worry. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edges of her coat, the cold biting through her thin gloves. Alex hesitated. He could hear the laughter of his co-workers from the break room, the clinking of glasses as they toasted the season. A part of him wanted to ignore the visitor, to let someone else take care of it, but another part of him, the part that couldn't stand to see someone stranded, propelled him toward the door. "Evening," he called, stepping into the cold. His breath misted in the air as he approached the woman. "Garage's closed, ma'am. What seems to be the problem?" The woman looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and relief. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, her voice shaky. "My car, it just stopped. I don't know what's wrong. I've been driving all day, trying to get home for Christmas." Alex studied the car. It was an older model, the kind that often came with a long list of hidden problems. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, and the front tires were coated in a layer of slush and grime. He glanced back at the garage, where the warm glow of light spilled out onto the snow. He could still hear the muffled sounds of celebration. "All right," he said with a sigh, motioning toward the garage. "Pull it in, and I'll take a look. But no promises, it's late, and part suppliers are closed for the holiday." The woman nodded gratefully and climbed back into her car, coaxing it to life long enough to limp into the garage. As Alex opened the hood, the engine hissed and steamed, a mess of tangled belts and leaking fluids. He muttered under his breath, already sensing that this wouldn't be a quick fix. Inside the break room, his co-workers were growing restless. "Come on, Alex," one of them called. "You've got to learn to say no sometimes. It's Christmas Eve." Alex ignored them, his focus on the task at hand. The woman stood nearby, shifting nervously from foot to foot. He glanced at her, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way she clutched her coat as if it were the only thing holding her together. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, trying to make conversation as he worked. She shook her head. "No, I'm just passing through. I was visiting my mom in the hospital. She's not doing well. I was trying to make it back to my kids before Christmas morning." Alex felt a pang of empathy. "That's tough," he said. "I'll do what I can, but this might take a while." Time stretched on as Alex worked, the minutes slipping into hours. The car's issues were more severe than he'd anticipated: a faulty alternator, a cracked radiator hose, and a battery on its last legs. Each problem seemed to lead to another, and with every discovery, Alex felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The woman offered to help, but there was little she could do. Instead, she hovered nearby, her eyes darting anxiously toward the clock. Alex could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands tightened into fists when she thought he wasn't looking. Finally, he stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cold. "I can patch it up enough to get you where you're going," he said. "But you'll need a proper repair once you reach your destination." The woman's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't helped." Alex nodded, trying to downplay his efforts. "It's what I do," he said simply. As he finished tightening the last bolt, he noticed something unusual in the trunk of the car. A small, locked box sat tucked beneath a pile of blankets. It wasn't out of place in itself, but something about the way the woman quickly moved to close the trunk caught his attention. "What's in the box?" he asked casually, not expecting an answer. The woman hesitated, her face clouding over. "Just some personal things," she said quickly. "Nothing important." Alex let it go, though the curiosity lingered in the back of his mind. He closed the hood and handed her the keys. "You're all set," he said. "Drive carefully, and get that radiator hose replaced as soon as you can." She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Merry Christmas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex watched as she climbed into the car and drove off into the night, the taillights disappearing into the swirling snow. He stood there for a moment, the cold seeping through his jacket, before turning back to the garage. Inside, the party was winding down. His co-workers had saved him a plate of food, but the laughter had faded, and the warmth of the celebration seemed distant. As Alex sat down to eat, he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's visit was only the beginning of something much larger. Little did he know, the events of that night would soon ripple through the town, unraveling secrets and testing the bonds of community in ways he could never have imagined. Alex's thoughts lingered on the mysterious woman long after she had driven away. He had seen countless stranded travelers come through his garage, but there was something different about her, something in the way she avoided his gaze when he asked about the box in her trunk or the way her voice wavered when she spoke about her children. He chalked it up to the stress of her situation and tried to push it from his mind as he cleaned up his tools. The garage was quiet now, his co-workers having gone home hours ago. The break room table still bore the remnants of their impromptu Christmas dinner, a half-eaten turkey, empty cans of soda, and a crumpled party hat someone had tossed aside. Alex barely noticed as he went through the familiar routine of locking up, his mind wandering back to the woman's car. The repairs he'd made were solid enough to get her through the night, but something about the condition of the vehicle didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just old, it looked neglected, like it had been driven hard for miles without a moment of care. As he switched off the lights and prepared to leave, a faint sound stopped him in his tracks. A car engine, distant but growing louder, broke through the stillness of the snowy night. Alex stepped outside, his boots crunching on the icy gravel, just as the same old sedan came sputtering back into the driveway. The woman emerged again, her face pale and her expression panicked. "I'm so sorry to bother you again," she said, her breath clouding in the cold air. "I didn't even make it out of town. The car just died." Alex nodded, motioning for her to pull back into the garage. "Let's take another look," he said, his tone calm but his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than a simple breakdown. As the car rolled into the garage, Alex opened the hood and began his inspection. The repairs he had made earlier were holding up fine, but now there was a new issue. The fuel line had ruptured, spilling gasoline onto the engine block. It was a dangerous problem, one that could have caused a fire if she had continued driving. "This wasn't like this before," Alex muttered, more to himself than to her. "Did you hit something on the way out?" The woman shook her head vehemently. "No, I didn't. I was driving carefully, I swear." Alex frowned. Fuel lines didn't just rupture on their own, especially not on a car that had already been thoroughly checked. He glanced at her, noting the way she avoided his gaze again. Something wasn't adding up. "Look," he said, setting his tools aside and crossing his arms. "I don't mean to pry, but is there something you're not telling me? This car has seen a lot of wear and tear. It's not just an old vehicle, it's been pushed to its limits. And that box in your trunk, you seemed pretty anxious about it earlier." The woman's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her hands gripping the edges of her coat. For a moment, Alex thought she might bolt, but then she let out a shaky breath and slumped against the wall. "You're right," she said quietly. "I haven't been completely honest with you. But it's not because I don't trust you, it's because I'm scared." Alex softened his stance, his arms dropping to his sides. "Scared of what?" She hesitated, glancing toward the garage door as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. Then, in a halting voice, she began to explain. "My name isn't Sarah," she said. "It's Emily. Emily Garrison. I'm a journalist." Alex raised an eyebrow. "A journalist? What are you doing driving through a small town like this in the middle of the night?" Emily took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she pulled her coat tighter around her. "I've been working on a story for months now. It's about a human trafficking ring operating in this region. I went undercover, pretending to be part of their network to gather evidence. A few days ago, I managed to escape with documents that could expose the entire operation." She paused, her eyes locking onto Alex's. "That box in my trunk, it has everything. Names, locations, financial records. If this gets to the authorities, it could shut them down for good." Alex stared at her, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "So, you're running from them? They're after you?" Emily nodded. "Yes. They've already tried to track me down. I thought I was safe, but then my car broke down here, and now I'm not so sure. I think they might have tampered with it to force me to stop." Alex felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He had been so focused on fixing the car that he hadn't considered the possibility of foul play. If what Emily was saying was true, then she wasn't just a stranded traveler, she was a target, and now, by helping her, he might be one too. "All right," he said after a long pause. "Here's what we're going to do. First, I'll fix your car again. This time, I'll make sure it's good enough to get you far away from here. Second, you're going to stay put until I'm done. If anyone comes looking for you, you don't answer the door. Got it?" Emily nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and fear. "Thank you," she said softly. "I didn't know who else to turn to." Alex waved her off, already reaching for his tools. "Don't thank me yet. We're not out of this mess." As he worked, Alex's mind raced with questions. Who were these people chasing Emily? How far would they go to silence her? And what would happen if they found her here? He shook his head, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. The fuel line was a mess, but he had the parts to replace it. With any luck, he could have her back on the road within an hour. But luck wasn't on their side. As Alex finished installing the new fuel line, the sound of a car engine rumbled outside. He froze, his hands gripping the wrench tightly. Emily's eyes widened in panic, and she ducked behind a workbench. "Stay there," Alex whispered, his voice low but firm. He moved to the garage door and peered through a crack. A black SUV was parked in the driveway, its windows tinted and its engine idling. Two men stepped out, their figures silhouetted against the headlights. They were tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark jackets that blended into the night. One of them carried a flashlight, its beam sweeping across the garage. Alex's heart pounded in his chest. These weren't locals, he was sure of it. They had the look of people who meant business, and he had no doubt they were here for Emily. Thinking quickly, Alex grabbed his phone and dialed the number for the local sheriff's office. But before he could hit send, the taller of the two men knocked on the garage door. "Hey," the man called, his voice deep and authoritative. "We're looking for someone." "A woman. She might have stopped here earlier." Alex hesitated, his thumb hovering over the call button. He could lie, send them on their way, but if they didn't believe him, things could escalate quickly. On the other hand, if he admitted Emily was here, he'd be putting her life, and his own, in immediate danger. Taking a deep breath, Alex slid the phone into his pocket and opened the door just enough to step outside. The cold night air bit at his skin, but he ignored it, his focus on the men in front of him. "Evening," he said, keeping his tone casual. "What can I do for you?" The man with the flashlight narrowed his eyes. "We're looking for someone. A journalist named Emily Garrison. We have reason to believe she might be in the area." Alex shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. "Haven't seen anyone like that. Just me here, fixing up a few cars before the holiday." The man studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, turning back toward the SUV. "All right. If you see anything, let us know." As they drove away, Alex let out a shaky breath. But he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The danger was only just beginning. The taillights of the black SUV faded into the distance, but the knot in Alex's stomach tightened rather than eased. He knew they'd be back. Men like that didn't give up easily, especially not when they were this close to whatever they were chasing. Alex turned back to the garage and locked the door securely behind him. Emily stepped out from behind the workbench, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Did they leave?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For now," Alex said, his voice low but firm. "But they'll be back. You need to tell me everything, no more holding back. If I'm going to help you, I need to know exactly what we're up against." Emily hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her coat. For a moment, Alex thought she might retreat into silence again, but then she sighed and nodded. "Okay," she said. "You're right. You deserve to know." She sat down on a stool near the workbench, her shoulders slumped. Alex leaned against the counter, crossing his arms as he waited for her to begin. "It started about a year ago," Emily said. "I was investigating a story about labor exploitation in rural factories, places where workers were being paid next to nothing, forced to live in squalid conditions. It was bad, but the deeper I dug, the more I realized it was just the tip of the iceberg." Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, the journalist in her taking over. "I found out that these factories were connected to a much larger operation, a network that wasn't just exploiting workers. They were trafficking people, moving them across state lines, even internationally. Women, children, entire families, it was horrifying." Alex frowned, his grip tightening on his arms. He'd heard about things like this on the news, but it always felt distant, like something that happened in other places, to other people. Hearing it laid out like this, from someone who had seen it up close, made it all too real. "I went undercover," Emily continued. "I posed as someone looking for work, someone desperate. It wasn't hard to convince them, I'd done my research, knew exactly what to say to get their attention. They took me in, made me part of their system. For months, I documented everything, names, transactions, routes. I even wore a hidden camera to record meetings." She paused, her hands clasping tightly together. "But then I got careless. I pushed too far, asked too many questions. They started to suspect me. One of their enforcers, this man named Victor, cornered me after a meeting and told me he'd been watching me. That's when I knew I had to get out." Emily's voice broke, and she looked down at her hands. "I barely escaped. I had to leave everything behind, my apartment, my friends, my life. The only thing I managed to take with me was that box in my trunk. It has all the evidence I collected, everything I need to expose them. Alex let out a slow breath, trying to process the enormity of what she was saying. And now they're after you, he said. They want to stop you before you can go public. Emily nodded. Yes. If they find me. I don't even want to think about what they'll do. For a moment, silence filled the garage, broken only by the hum of the overhead lights. Alex ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. This wasn't just about fixing a car anymore. It wasn't even about helping a stranded woman. This was life or death, and he had just been dragged into the middle of it. All right, he said finally. Here's what we're going to do. First, I'll finish fixing your car. But you can't leave yet, not until we're sure it's safe. Second, we need to figure out a way to throw them off your trail. Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide. How? They've already found me here. They'll come back. Alex nodded. Exactly. Which is why we need to make them think you've gone somewhere else. He pulled out his phone and began typing a message. I know a guy, Jeremy. He runs a towing service just outside town. If we can get your car to him, he can drive it to a different location and park it there. When those guys come back, they'll follow the car and waste time chasing a dead end. Emily frowned. But what about me? What if they realize I'm still here? Alex gave her a reassuring smile. Don't worry. I've got a plan for that too. An hour later, the sound of a tow truck rumbled outside the garage. Jeremy, a burly man with a thick beard and a no-nonsense attitude, stepped out and greeted Alex with a firm handshake. You weren't kidding when you said it was urgent, he said, glancing at the old sedan. What's the story? Alex gave him a brief explanation, leaving out the more dangerous details. Let's just say someone's in trouble and needs some time to get out of town. Can you help? Jeremy nodded. You got it. I'll take the car to my lot and make sure it's parked somewhere they'll find it. If they follow me, they'll be on a wild goose chase for hours. Thanks, Jeremy. I owe you one, Alex said, clapping him on the shoulder. As Jeremy drove off with the car, Emily watched from the window, her expression a mix of relief and anxiety. Do you really think this will work? She asked. It'll buy us some time, Alex said. And time is what we need right now. But as the minutes ticked by, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were still vulnerable. The SUV might have driven off, but there was no guarantee the men wouldn't come back, or that they weren't already watching from a distance. He needed to find a way to get Emily out of town, and fast. Come on, he said, grabbing his jacket. We can't stay here. There's a diner down the road, Betty's Place. It's open 24/7, and it's always busy. If we sit there for a while, we'll be surrounded by people. They won't try anything in a crowded place. Emily hesitated but eventually nodded. Okay. Let's go. They walked the short distance to the diner, the snow crunching under their feet. Inside, the warm glow of neon lights and the hum of conversation provided a welcome contrast to the cold, empty streets. Alex led Emily to a booth in the corner, where they could see the entrance but remain inconspicuous. As they sipped on steaming cups of coffee, Alex kept a close eye on the door. Every time it swung open, his muscles tensed, but it was always just another local coming in for a late-night meal. Emily, meanwhile, seemed lost in thought, her hands wrapped around her mug. I don't know how to thank you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You didn't have to do any of this. Alex shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. I couldn't just leave you out there. Besides, I've always been a sucker for a good story. Emily chuckled softly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. But the moment of levity was short-lived. As Alex glanced out the window, his heart sank. The black SUV was back, parked across the street, its headlights off but its engine still running. "They've found us," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Stay calm. We need to act like we haven't noticed them." Emily's eyes darted to the window, but Alex placed a hand on her arm to steady her. "Listen to me," he said. "We can't run, they'll see us. But we can't stay here forever either. I'll think of something. Just trust me." As the SUV's door opened and one of the men stepped out, Alex knew they were out of time. Whatever he did next would determine whether they made it out of this alive. The warmth of the diner seemed to evaporate the moment Alex saw the man step out of the SUV. The man was tall, wearing a dark coat that flared slightly in the icy wind, and his gaze swept across the street with the precision of a predator. Alex leaned forward, lowering his voice as he spoke to Emily. "Don't look directly at him," he said, his tone calm but firm. "We don't want to give anything away. Just stay quiet, and let me think." Emily froze, her hands tightening around her coffee mug. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale. Alex reached across the table and touched her hand gently, trying to steady her. "We'll get out of this," he said. "But you have to trust me." The man outside the SUV was scanning the area, his eyes briefly resting on the diner before moving on. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, but Alex knew better than to underestimate him. This wasn't someone who would act without a plan. A waitress approached their booth, a cheerful smile plastered across her face as she held a pot of coffee. "Refills?" she asked. Alex nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, please." "Busy night, huh?" She shrugged, glancing at the half-empty diner. "Quiet for now, but it'll pick up around the midnight shift." "You two just passing through?" "Something like that," Alex replied, keeping his tone light. He hoped his casual demeanor would help mask the tension that gripped his every muscle. As the waitress moved on, Alex glanced out the window again. The man had retreated to the SUV, but the vehicle hadn't left. Instead, it idled quietly, as if waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Alex's mind raced. They couldn't stay in the diner forever, but stepping outside would be just as dangerous. He leaned closer to Emily. "I have an idea," he said. "It's risky, but it might be our best shot." "What is it?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible. "Do you see the door in the back? Near the kitchen?" She nodded. "I'm going to create a distraction," Alex said. "When I do, you're going to slip out that door and head to the alley behind the diner. Stay low and out of sight. I'll meet you there." Emily's eyes widened in alarm. "What kind of distraction?" "Something loud," Alex said, his mind already forming a plan. "Don't worry about me. Just focus on getting out of here." Emily hesitated, but finally nodded. "Okay," she said. "I trust you." Alex slid out of the booth and made his way toward the counter, where the waitress was chatting with the cook. He grabbed a napkin from the dispenser and scribbled a quick note, "Call the police. Suspicious man in a black SUV outside." He slid the note across the counter to the waitress, who gave him a confused look. "Trust me," Alex said quietly. "It's important." Before she could respond, Alex turned and walked toward the front of the diner, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed something big, something that would draw attention away from Emily but wouldn't put anyone else in danger. His eyes landed on the dessert display case near the entrance. Perfect. With a swift motion, Alex stumbled forward, knocking into the display case and sending it crashing to the floor. Glass shattered, and the sound echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Customers turned to look, startled, as Alex staggered back, clutching his foot and muttering apologies. "I'm so sorry," he said loudly, drawing as much attention to himself as possible. "I didn't see it, my foot slipped." The waitress hurried over, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" I'm fine, Alex said, waving her off. Really, I'm fine. I'll pay for the damages. I just need a minute. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Emily slip out of the booth and head toward the kitchen. She moved quickly but quietly, her head down and her coat pulled tight around her. Within seconds, she was gone, disappearing through the back door as planned. Alex felt a small surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The man from the SUV had entered the diner. He stood near the entrance, scanning the room with an intensity that made Alex's skin crawl. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low but commanding. "I'm looking for someone." A woman, mid-30s, dark hair. She might have come in here. The waitress hesitated, glancing at Alex. He shook his head subtly, willing her not to say anything. "I haven't seen anyone like that," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Just regular customers tonight." The man's gaze lingered on her for a moment before shifting to Alex. "You," he said, stepping closer. "Have you seen her?" Alex forced himself to meet the man's eyes. "No," he said evenly. "Sorry, can't help you." The man studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then he nodded, seemingly satisfied. "If you do see her," he said, pulling a card from his pocket and placing it on the counter, "give me a call. It's urgent." Alex watched as the man left the diner and returned to the SUV. The vehicle lingered for another minute before finally pulling away, its taillights disappearing into the night. Alex let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He apologized again to the waitress, paid for the damages, and hurried out the back door. Emily was waiting in the alley, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. She looked up as Alex approached, relief washing over her face. "You made it," she said. "Of course," Alex replied, though his voice was tight with exhaustion. "Come on. We need to keep moving." They made their way down the alley, sticking to the shadows. Alex led Emily toward a small used car lot he knew was usually unattended at night. It wasn't ideal, but it would provide temporary shelter while they figured out their next move. As they slipped into the lot, Alex's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from Jeremy, "Cars in position. They took the bait and followed me out of town. You're clear for now." Alex showed the message to Emily, and she let out a shaky laugh. "You really thought of everything, didn't you?" "Not everything," Alex admitted. "But enough to keep us alive." They found an unlocked sedan at the back of the lot and climbed inside, grateful for the shelter from the cold. Emily leaned back in the passenger seat, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Alex didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stared out the window, his mind racing with the events of the night. They were safe for now, but he knew it wasn't over. The men chasing Emily wouldn't give up easily, and the evidence she carried was too important to fall into the wrong hands. As the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Alex made a silent vow. He would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The first light of dawn crept through the horizon, casting a pale orange glow over the used car lot. Alex sat in the driver's seat of the sedan, his fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. The night's events had left him wired, every nerve in his body on edge. Beside him, Emily dozed fitfully in the passenger seat, her head leaning against the window, the faint lines of worry still etched on her face even in sleep. Alex's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from Jeremy, "They're still sniffing around the outskirts. You've got a small window to move, but it won't last long. Be careful." Alex sighed, running a hand through his hair. They couldn't stay here. The SUV might have left the diner, but whoever was after Emily was still relentless. He turned to her, hesitant to wake her up, but time was ticking. Gently, he shook her shoulder. "Emily," he said softly. We've got to go. Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around groggily, confusion flickering across her face before the events of the previous night rushed back to her. Are they still out there? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Not here, Alex replied. But they're not far. We need to move before they circle back. Emily nodded, sitting up and rubbing her temples. Where do we go? They seem to have eyes everywhere. Alex hesitated. He didn't want to worry her, but the truth was, their options were limited. He'd already burned through most of his connections in town, and the resources Jeremy could provide were stretched thin. Still, he had an idea. There's someone I know, he said. An old friend of mine. She's off the grid, so to speak. If anyone can keep us safe for a while, it's her. Do you trust her? Emily asked, her voice laced with concern. With my life, Alex said firmly. But getting to her won't be easy. It's a couple of hours out of town, and we'll have to avoid main roads. Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. Let's do it. They left the car lot cautiously, Alex weaving through backstreets and side roads to avoid being spotted. The town was just beginning to wake up, the early morning light casting long shadows across empty streets. Alex's senses were on high alert, every passing car or distant sound setting his heart racing. But for now, it seemed they were in the clear. As they drove, Emily broke the silence. Alex, she said, her voice hesitant. I think you deserve to know what's really going on. Alex glanced at her. Only if you're ready, he said. I'm not here to pressure you. She nodded, taking a deep breath. The files I have, they're more than just financial records. They're proof of something much bigger. The company I worked for, Argent Corp, has been running a massive scheme. Money laundering, illegal deals, even ties to organized crime. I didn't realize the extent of it until I stumbled across the files by accident. Alex frowned. And you're sure these files are enough to take them down? They're airtight, Emily said. Names, dates, transactions, all of it. But that's why they're so desperate to get them back. If these documents go public, it could dismantle the entire operation and send some very powerful people to prison. Alex let out a low whistle. No wonder they're pulling out all the stops. You're not just a loose end, they see you as a threat. Emily nodded grimly. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I couldn't look the other way. Too many innocent people are being hurt. Alex felt a surge of admiration for her. Despite the danger she was in, Emily had chosen to do the right thing, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. You did the right thing, he said. And I'll do everything I can to make sure those files get where they need to go. The road ahead was quiet, the landscape shifting from urban sprawl to open countryside. Alex's friend, Lena, lived in a remote cabin tucked away in the hills, far from prying eyes. It was the perfect place to lay low, at least for a little while. As they neared the outskirts of town, Alex noticed a car in the rearview mirror. It was a nondescript sedan, but it had been trailing them for the last few miles. His grip on the wheel tightened. We might have company, he said, his voice tense. Emily turned to look, her eyes wide with fear. Are they following us? I don't know yet, Alex said. But I'm not taking any chances. He pressed down on the accelerator, the engine humming as the car picked up speed. The sedan behind them matched his pace, closing the gap slightly. Alex's heart raced. This wasn't a coincidence. Hold on, he said, his voice steely. He veered off the main road onto a narrow, winding path that cut through the woods. The car jolted as it hit the uneven terrain, but Alex kept his foot on the gas, weaving through the trees with practiced precision. The sedan followed, its headlights bouncing erratically over the rough ground. Alex's mind raced, calculating their options. He knew these woods well, but the other driver didn't seem to care about the risk. Whoever they were determined to catch them. Up ahead, Alex spotted a fork in the path. He took the right-hand turn sharply, the tires skidding slightly on the loose dirt. Then, without warning, he killed the headlights and steered the car off the path, into a dense thicket of trees. He brought the car to a stop and motioned for Emily to stay quiet. They sat in silence, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Moments later, the sedan roared past, its driver oblivious to their hiding spot. Alex waited until the sound of the engine faded into the distance before exhaling in relief. "That was too close," Emily whispered. "Yeah," Alex agreed. "But we're not out of the woods yet." Literally. They continued on foot, abandoning the car to avoid leaving a trail. The trek was arduous, the cold biting at their exposed skin, but Alex pressed on, leading Emily through the dense underbrush. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached Lena's cabin. The structure was modest but sturdy, nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a sign that Lena was home. Alex knocked on the door, his heart pounding. The door creaked open, and Lena appeared, a shotgun in hand. Her sharp eyes softened when she saw Alex. "Well, I'll be damned," she said. "Alex Carter. Haven't seen you in years." "Sorry to drop in unannounced," Alex said. "But we need your help." Lena's gaze shifted to Emily, taking in her disheveled appearance and the fear in her eyes. Without a word, she stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. "You'd better tell me everything," she said. "And I mean everything." As they stepped into the warmth of the cabin, Alex felt a glimmer of hope. Lena was the most resourceful person he knew, and if anyone could help them navigate the storm ahead, it was her. But even as he began to explain their situation, he couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Inside Lena's cabin, the warmth of the crackling fire enveloped Alex and Emily, but the tension in the air was palpable. Lena listened intently as Alex laid out the situation, her piercing eyes darting between him and Emily. Her weathered face remained expressionless, but Alex knew her well enough to recognize the gears turning in her mind. When he finished, Lena leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. "You sure know how to pick your battles, Alex," she said finally, her voice tinged with dry humor. "And you," she added, turning to Emily, "you've got guts. Sticking your neck out against a corporation like Argent Corp? That takes more than courage, it takes a death wish." Emily shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said quietly. "I just couldn't let them get away with it." Lena studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Fair enough. But if you're staying here, you're going to have to follow my rules. No phones, no unnecessary noise, and definitely no stepping outside unless I say so. Understand?" Emily nodded, and Alex gave Lena a grateful smile. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't know where else to go." Lena waved him off. "Don't thank me yet. You've brought trouble to my doorstep, and I'm not exactly in the business of running a safe house. But I owe you, Alex, and I always repay my debts." The three of them spent the next few hours devising a plan. Lena's remote location would keep them hidden for a while, but it was only a matter of time before Argent Corp's reach extended even here. They needed a way to get the files into the hands of someone who could use them, someone with the power to expose Argent Corp's corruption on a global scale. Lena's contacts were vast and eclectic, a result of her years living off the grid and working in the shadows. She promised to reach out to a trusted journalist who specialized in uncovering corporate scandals. "If anyone can take these bastards down, it's him," she said. "But it'll take a day or two to make contact. Until then, you're on lockdown." As night fell, Alex and Emily settled into the small guest room Lena had prepared for them. The room was sparse but comfortable, with 2 narrow cots and a single window that looked out onto the dense forest. Emily sat on the edge of her cot, staring out the window, her expression distant. "Are you okay?" Alex asked, sitting down beside her. Emily nodded slowly. "I'm just tired. It feels like no matter how far we run, they're always right behind us." Alex placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll get through this," he said. "You're not alone in this fight." For the first time in what felt like days, Emily smiled, albeit faintly. "Thank you, Alex. For everything." The next morning, Lena woke them early. "We've got a problem," she announced, her tone grim. "One of my perimeter sensors was tripped a few hours ago. I checked the feed, someone's out there." Alex felt his stomach drop. "How close?" "Too close for comfort," Lena replied. "They're moving slow, probably trying to scout the area. But it's only a matter of time before they find the cabin." Emily's face went pale. "What do we do?" Lena crossed her arms. "We prepare. If they come knocking, we're not going down without a fight." The 3 of them spent the next few hours fortifying the cabin. Lena handed Alex a rifle and showed Emily how to use a small handgun. "I don't like violence," Lena said, "but if it's between us and them, you'd better believe I'll do whatever it takes to keep us alive." As the day wore on, the tension became almost unbearable. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside felt like a prelude to an attack. Alex kept a watchful eye on the forest, his finger hovering near the trigger of his rifle. Emily stayed close to Lena, her nerves frayed but her resolve unbroken. The attack came at dusk. A black SUV roared into the clearing, its headlights cutting through the fading light. Alex barely had time to shout a warning before the cabin was peppered with gunfire. The sound was deafening, shattering the fragile calm of the forest. Lena was the first to return fire, her shotgun blasting through the front door. Alex followed suit, aiming carefully and taking out one of the SUV's tires. The vehicle swerved, its occupants scrambling for cover behind the trees. Emily crouched in the corner of the cabin, clutching the handgun Lena had given her. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were fierce. "What do we do now?" she shouted over the chaos. "Hold them off as long as we can," Lena yelled. "Help is on the way." True to her word, Lena had called her journalist contact earlier that day, and he had promised to send backup. But whether that backup would arrive in time was anyone's guess. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. The attackers were well trained, their movements coordinated and precise. But Lena's knowledge of the terrain, combined with Alex's sharpshooting skills, gave them a fighting chance. At one point, Emily spotted a figure trying to flank the cabin. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, she aimed her handgun and fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough to send the attacker retreating. Alex glanced back at her and gave her a nod of approval. "Good job," he said. "Keep it up." Finally, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the night. The attackers hesitated, their focus shifting toward the new threat. Moments later, a convoy of unmarked vehicles burst into the clearing, their occupants spilling out and overwhelming the attackers in a matter of seconds. Lena lowered her shotgun, a look of relief washing over her face. "That's my guy," she said with a faint smile. The journalist, a wiry man with sharp features and a determined expression, stepped out of one of the vehicles. "I checked the feed, someone's out there." Alex felt his stomach drop. "How close?" "Too close for comfort," Lena replied. "They're moving slow, probably trying to scout the area. But it's only a matter of time before they find the cabin." Emily's face went pale. "What do we do?" Lena crossed her arms. "We prepare. If they come knocking, we're not going down without a fight." The 3 of them spent the next few hours fortifying the cabin. Lena handed Alex a rifle and showed Emily how to use a small handgun. "I don't like violence," Lena said, "but if it's between us and them, you'd better believe I'll do whatever it takes to keep us alive." As the day wore on, the tension became almost unbearable. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside felt like a prelude to an attack. Alex kept a watchful eye on the forest, his finger hovering near the trigger of his rifle. Emily stayed close to Lena, her nerves frayed but her resolve unbroken. The attack came at dusk. A black SUV roared into the clearing, its headlights cutting through the fading light. Alex barely had time to shout a warning before the cabin was peppered with gunfire. The sound was deafening, shattering the fragile calm of the forest. Lena was the first to return fire, her shotgun blasting through the front door. Alex followed suit, aiming carefully and taking out one of the SUV's tires. The vehicle swerved, its occupants scrambling for cover behind the trees. Emily crouched in the corner of the cabin, clutching the handgun Lena had given her. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were fierce. "What do we do now?" she shouted over the chaos. "Hold them off as long as we can," Lena yelled. "Help is on the way." True to her word, Lena had called her journalist contact earlier that day, and he had promised to send backup. But whether that backup would arrive in time was anyone's guess. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. The attackers were well trained, their movements coordinated and precise. But Lena's knowledge of the terrain, combined with Alex's sharpshooting skills, gave them a fighting chance. At one point, Emily spotted a figure trying to flank the cabin. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, she aimed her handgun and fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough to send the attacker retreating. Alex glanced back at her and gave her a nod of approval. "Good job," he said. "Keep it up." Finally, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the night. The attackers hesitated, their focus shifting toward the new threat. Moments later, a convoy of unmarked vehicles burst into the clearing, their occupants spilling out and overwhelming the attackers in a matter of seconds. Lena lowered her shotgun, a look of relief washing over her face. "That's my guy," she said with a faint smile. The journalist, a wiry man with sharp features and a determined expression, stepped out of one of the vehicles.